Welcome. My name is Tracy Metz. I'm the director of the John Adams Institute. Our mission is to bring the best and the brightest of American thinking to the Netherlands. For over 30 years, we've been doing that face-to-face, and actually, our guest of this evening, Esther Safran-Foer, was supposed to be here this evening live. But in times of Corona, we have rapidly pivoted to doing online events live, today in the studio of Pakhuis de Zwijger. It feels a little lonely, but it works. And for now, we are offering these live online events to you for free. We want you to know that we're still here. Our guest this evening is, of course, Esther Safran-Foer, who is here at her home in Washington, D.C., to talk about her memoir, I Want You to Know We're Still Here, a post-Holocaust memoir. Translated by publisher Spectrum as Ik wil je laten weten dat we er nog zijn. I would like to mention also that Spectrum was the first to publish the book in translation, in Dutch. The German, French, Italian, Spanish, and Hebrew translations are to follow. It is the story of her life lived in the shadow of absence. The absence of her entire family murdered in their villages in then Poland, now Ukraine. The absence of her father, who survived the massacre, who found a new wife, had a new daughter, escaped to Germany, then escaped to the US, only to commit suicide 5 years later. Because you have survived the Holocaust doesn't mean you've survived the war in your mind. He became a victim of the war after the fact. But many of those ghosts have come to life after all, thanks to Esther's diligent research and her need to bring them back to life through memory. Not history, but memory. We'll talk about that later. Some practicalities. Esther will first give a talk, then we'll move on to the interview, and in the meantime, please go ahead and send us your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please do try to keep them short so that I can read them during the interview. And don't wait for me to say so, you can send in your questions anytime. And afterwards, the recording of this live interview will also be available on our website, www.john-adams.nl. Now it is my pleasure and my honor to welcome Esther Safran-Foer.
Thank you so much. I was really hoping to be there with you in person, but alas, that'll have to wait for another time. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to start with a few readings from the book. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction from the beginning and then jump right into the middle. So let me start with the first paragraph. My birth certificate says that I was born on September 8th, 1946 in Ziegenheim, Germany. It's the wrong date, the wrong city, and even the wrong country. It would take me years to understand why my father created this fabrication, why each year my mother would come into my room on March 17th, give me a kiss, and whisper, "Happy birthday." So that's how my life began. It began actually in Lodz, Poland in 46 in March, and our family snuck across the border. I'm not sure exactly when, I think in August, as best I can piece the story together. August, September. We crossed the border. We were in a flat-bottom truck that was hidden. My mother tells me that she had to gag me for part of the trip. So at the most dangerous part where we might be discovered, she would put rags in my mouth. And we made our way to Germany right under the Iron Curtain, sometime in mid to late 46. And then I'm going to tell you about where I spent those first few years of my life. You can see behind Tracy a photograph of a little girl on a tricycle. That's me. And I spent a lot of time looking at those photographs. I have lots of photographs from that period. You see what you want to see, or maybe what you need to see in a photograph. This is from chapter 5. And for much of my life, I would look at the pictures from the almost 3 years we spent in Germany and see all the signs of a normal family life. There I am, mugging for the camera, perched on my tricycle, and another photo looking adorably overwhelmed in my too big, fluffy white rabbit hooded coat. And there are my parents, fashionably dressed again, surrounded by friends, seated in outdoor picnics. But when you look closer, not in this particular picture, but some of my others, in the background, there are watchtowers, rundown barracks, barbed wire fences. We were exiles, stateless, people without a country. In Hebrew, we were called the surviving remnant. We were displaced persons, and accordingly, we were assigned to live in a displaced persons camp. The DP camps, where most Jewish refugees ended up after the war, were an often forgotten epilogue to the history of the Second War. The very existence of these camps is referenced only in passing, if at all, in the vast body of Holocaust literature, even though 300,000 Jewish survivors, 35 to 1950. I'm going to jump a little bit in this section. Summer of 1945, Jews who had survived concentration camps or had managed to hide or had joined up with partisans or had survived in the Soviet Union began arriving in Germany, viewing it as a stop on the way to a better life. The Allied plan was to repatriate the refugees to their home countries. For Jewish refugees, though, this wasn't an option. Not only were their homes gone and their families murdered, but in some cases, the local population, their former friends and neighbors, had aided in the persecution. Understandably, they refused to go back, and no other countries wanted them. Palestine was closed to legal immigration. And even the United States, where we ultimately end up, had immigration quotas that favored non-Jews. Virtually every option for immigration out of the graveyard of Europe was closed. I'm going to jump around here a little bit and tell you that this period, when hundreds of DP camps were established, not just in Germany, but in Austria and Italy, the accommodations were largely improvised. On one end of the spectrum, a DP camp was set up in a castle, but that was rare. But at the other end, it was set up in a former concentration camp. Any available edifice had to do, including concentration camps, hospitals, private homes, army barracks, or POW camps. The camps were often filthy, reflecting poor preparation by the Allies, plain negligence, or in some cases, outright contempt for the Jewish refugees. Basic necessities such as underwear, shoes, toilet paper, toothbrushes were in short supply. Some refugees still wore striped pajamas from the concentration camps. And just as horrifying, others were given German SS uniforms to wear. There were reports that the refugees were provided with less food per day than the German prisoners of war were receiving. And the situation was so bad that reports had gotten back to the United States to President Truman. And he ultimately asked Earl Harrison, the head of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, a former commissioner of immigration, to personally investigate the situations in the DP camps. Harrison reported back August 1, 1945, that conditions were so grim that the quote, "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except we're not exterminating them." The worst situation was reported to have developed in southern Germany, in the camps under General George Patton. Patton wrote in his diary that he believed the Jewish DPs or a subhuman species without any of the culture or social refinement of our time. So that's how I spent the first 3 years of my life. But honestly, until I wrote the book, I had no idea what that looked like. I kept looking at the pictures of that cute little girl on a tricycle. I had two parents who adored me. I had no idea what they were going through as they were trying to build new lives, and nobody in the world wanted us. Tracy, shall I read from another section as well now, or?
Read us another short bit, Esther.
Okay, another very short read. So the book is filled with horrible images of the Holocaust, of what happened to my parents, of the stories of life after the war as we were in these DP camps. But the book also contains the story of my search for my family's history, for the story, to find out more about the ghosts that I grew up with, that I had lived with, to walk the. Ultimately, I went back to Ukraine. I did it with my oldest son, to breathe the air and walk the streets that our family came from. I wasn't sure what I would find. Ultimately, I found a whole lot more than I ever expected. But I want to tell you, that portion of the trip was really funny. Our days, and I'm going to read, this is later in the book, our days in Ukraine were divided into 4 segments. Frank, my oldest son, and I timed our trip to coincide with the arrival of our fellow Israeli and American Trochenbrothers. That's the village that my father's family came from. And with them, we planned to visit the shtetl, or rather what was left of the place. On our own, we planned to explore Kolki, my mother's shtetl, and Lisht, a place I ultimately learned my father had lived during the war and where his first wife and daughter were murdered, and to meet the family we hoped was the one who hid my father during the war. Then finally, we'd have a couple of days on our own in Lvov. So Frank and I flew into Lvov, and the first day or two we were on our own. We were eating in a local pizza restaurant every night because we were afraid to eat anywhere else. We didn't know what the food was. And my mother told me, whatever you do, don't eat what they give you. And then one evening, as Frank and I returned from our intimate meal, the woman at the front desk of the hotel informed us that a busload of Israelis, accompanied by some Americans, had just arrived from Kiev. She didn't really need to tell us. They were hard to miss. Seated in the Hotel Ukraina's dining room, they were talking at Tel Aviv decibels. It felt as though the Israeli Defense Forces had finally descended to protect us. And even if they were a noisy bunch, it was comforted to be surrounded by our fellow landsmen. The head of the group from Israel, called Beital, Moti Litvak, rushed over to us, and particularly rushed over to Frank. So I have to say that the story of our family was first a work of fiction written by our middle son, Jonathan Safran Foer, who I know has spoken to this audience before. But he went to Ukraine, he didn't find anything. He wrote a work of fiction, but he put this little village on the map. So here, the head of this group rushed over to Frank and said excitedly, "So you're the hero of Trochenbrod." He, of course, was assuming Frank was Jonathan, and he was referring to Everything is Illuminated, which in large part was responsible for everyone being here. Frank explained that he was Jonathan's brother and an author himself. Mutty seemed unimpressed. "Okay," he said, "so you're the brother of the hero from Trochenbrod." This was only the beginning of endless comments and questions to do with Jonathan's book and movie, which were total fiction. And we were asked repeatedly, why isn't Jonathan here? The whole trip with the Ukrainians was totally amazing. We went to this village that no longer exists. It's just a field. It doesn't even have roads leading to it. And yet some of the Israelis who had grown up there were describing every little thing that happened in the field. Shmuel Potesh took the megaphone and, like a human GPS system, began to explain where everyone had once lived. He not only knew the names, but had interesting facts and bits of gossip about virtually everyone in the village, magically bringing the shtetl to life. In addition, a beautiful map had been provided to us by the Israelis. I could see where my grandmother had lived. I could see where my great aunts had lived. Shmuel led the group through Trochenbrod, microphone in hand, delivering a colorful, if not hysterically rambling monologue. He brought along 12 members of his own family, children and grandchildren. He wanted to show them where he came from in detail. He had a story to go with each house. This guy had been known as Moishe the Fat. This guy was Ellie with the lump on his head. This guy loved the ugliest girl in town. And what ultimately happened is the survivors started fighting about who lived where, which was absolutely amazing because there was nothing. There weren't even trees, there weren't roads. But it was so important to them to identify where they had lived. There was a woman who spotted the place where she had grown up and went into the field and grabbed flowers. She said, I never thought I'd be here again. And so, in the midst of this somber story, there was humor, there were beautiful moments, and there were fascinating people that we met and secrets that we uncovered.
On the back of your book, Esther, there's a blurb by the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, where your son works, and he calls you the matriarch of America's leading literary family. All three of your sons, Franklin, Jonathan, and Joshua, are literary and intellectual figures in their own right. And as you said, Jonathan has spoken at the John Adams 3 times. And I wondered how it felt for you. I mean, no matter how brilliant or eloquent your memoir is, you may hate me for saying this, but you will always stand in the shadow of Jonathan's novel, Everything is Illuminated, also about his search for his roots in Ukraine. And I was wondering, did the stellar success of this book, translated into 30 languages, made into a film, it opened up new avenues for you for information. Did it make you nervous about writing your own story? Did you feel him looking over your shoulder all the time?
Well, I felt like all three of my sons were looking over my shoulder. And I much as if I was doing it in their shadow, but really I was standing on their shoulders. And what was interesting is that the original plan was for me to write the book with Frank, who took the trip with me. And for a variety of reasons, Frank couldn't do that. He had his own book to write. And ultimately, I had to sit down and do this myself. And that became very important. Telling the story myself, finding my own voice, and dealing with my own emotions about what had happened to my family during the war, about my father's suicide once we'd been in the United States, about this half sibling I knew nothing about. It turned out to be such an important emotional period, actually taking pen to paper, or I guess, keyboard to the computer screen, that I am so glad I had the opportunity to do it myself. And I'm grateful to my sons that I could stand on their shoulders. I didn't actually share the book with them till it was almost done. I think I felt I had to go through this process alone. And frankly, I was a little intimidated.
Well, who wouldn't be? Who wouldn't be with sons of such literary stature? And did you give it to them to read as part of their family history, or for fact checking, or what was their role in the final round of the book?
Not fact checking. The book had already gone through fact checkers. And of course, I knew more facts than they did. I gave it to them as sons, as writers, as sort of my last line before it went to press. And I've had the wonderful opportunity of doing interviews like this with two of them.
Oh.
And it was so powerful. I have found these Zoom interviews to be amazing, much as I would want to be in Amsterdam with all of you and see the real audience. there's something very powerful of not being involved in a performance, but a deeper conversation with a moderator and a computer screen between us.
Yeah. Everything is illuminated, which I guess you would put in the genre of magical realism, was also made into a movie. And I wanted to ask you something about that. First, we'll look at a short trailer.
Your grandfather wanted you to have this photograph for your collection.
Who is Augustine? Grandma?
Jonathan is traveling halfway around the world
You my translator?
Forgive my speaking of English, Jonathan, as I'm not so premium with it.
to search for the woman who saved his grandfather in World War II.
It's my grandfather, Saffron.
And this is Augustina? This is our driver. Please, do not be distressed. This is only driver seeing eye, bitch.
Wait, he's blind?
Only he thinks this. Father informs me you are writing a book about this trip.
I'm not a writer, more of a collector.
And what do you collect?
Things. Family things.
In a world far from ordinary,
It's nice.
Make sure to secure the door when I'm gone. There are many dangerous people who want to take things from Americans and also kidnap them. Good night.
in a place far from home,
I'm a vegetarian.
You're a what?
I don't eat meat.
Pork?
No.
Chickens?
No.
And what about the sausage?
No meat.
What is wrong with you?
one man's quest for the truth
Why do you do this?
Sometimes I'm afraid I'll forget.
is about to unlock a secret
It is not so unusual,
What?
not knowing.
that will change all of their lives.
Saffron.
Everything is illuminated.
In the movie, Jonathan is called a collector, and we see rows and rows of Ziploc bags pinned to the wall. What's with the bags, Esther? There's a story there.
So I don't know exactly what's in his bags. There is a story there. He is a collector, and I'm also a collector. He came by that honestly. And I don't know if you can see over my shoulder in the living room, there's a painting, and underneath are a bunch of little jars. And in my case, I collect dirt from places that I visited. In those jars are dirt from the mass graves where my family is buried. But there are also some really happy memories of summers with my grandchildren. And in fact, my youngest grandson, when he went to Israel for the first time, decided to bring me back a bag of sand from the beach from his first trip. And he got so excited about that. He then went to Greece the next summer and brought me back another bag from Greece. So I guess Jonathan was a collector, but it started right here at home. His collection used to be Ziploc bags taped to his college dorm wall. Mine is kind of neat and looks like almost like an art installation.
It
But
does. It does indeed. We have a photo of you in which you're holding up an old photograph of 4 people.
Right.
Tell us about those people, Esther.
So this is the picture. I mean, it's almost the way it was described in the movie, that my mother had this picture and she told us, and it was always in our family, that these were the people who had hidden your father sometime during the war. And I guess there was always this dream of finding them, of somehow saying thank you. I'm alive today because those people risked their lives and the lives of their children for us. My 3 sons are alive because of those people. And it was those people that Jonathan was looking for when he went to Ukraine and wrote Everything is Illuminated. The interesting thing is he thought it's a father and his daughter and another cousin in that picture. I later learned that when I went. The man wanted my father to come back and marry his daughter. And Jonathan was looking for that woman. On the back of that picture, there's some scribbles. And one thing that looked to us like it said Augustine. So we thought Augustine was that woman's name. Hence Augustine in the movie. Well, it's not her name. Her name is Katerina. And so the magical realism of Augustine led us to the real Katerina.
And to many more family members and memories of family and of people who helped your family to survive. It's an extraordinary story, Esther.
Many discoveries. And, you know, if anybody is out there looking for their family history, whatever their family history is, start talking to the oldest people you know, put pieces together, and don't wait too long. I was able to make the trip in 2009. Many of the people I met on that trip have since died. These were old people who remembered stories about my family or were somehow involved with my family. It was a remarkable journey, a journey of discovery and a journey of finding truth for myself. And I urge everybody to embark on some part of the journey that they're comfortable with.
And you really went deep with your research. You went into DNA. You hired someone from the FBI who you hoped would give you clarity about some photographs. You did everything you could.
Well, you know, I was partially a daughter looking for my father and his past, and I was partially an investigator who was really into the investigative process and putting pieces together. And when a friend of mine suggested that I show that picture along with other pictures that someone had found in Ukraine that thought was a match, that I hire an FBI forensic photography expert, I thought, well, why not? So the journey was both emotional and fun, if you will. I met with the FBI agent. He ultimately gave me some clues unexpectedly that broke the story. I spent an hour with him and $250 for his services 10 years ago. And we looked at the pictures and we measured distances between facial features. The picture that I had and the picture that the researcher I'd hired in Ukraine had been able to find. And he said, I can't tell you it's them. But then he said, I can't tell you it's not them. And he told me that when I go to Ukraine, that I should look at the clothes people wear. These were not people with huge wardrobes. And if they were having their picture taken, they may be in the same outfit. And that turned out to be a very important clue that helped break the case, if you will.
Okay. Spoiler alert. We won't give that one away.
Okay.
I wanted to come back to the issue that I mentioned in my introduction about memory and history. In your book, you mention often the importance of memory, collective memory, in keeping people and events alive. I quote, Jews are a people of memories, not of history. And another beautiful quote, which will stay with me for a long time after having read your book, history is public, memory is personal. But at the same time, your parents seemed to want to escape from their memories. They not cherish them. They wanted to move on. They wanted to leave all that behind us. So the role of memories for Jews as a people seems to be a very different one from that of survivors who are just trying to get away from all that and build up a new life for themselves.
You know, I don't know that my parents had a choice. They had been through such terrible times. And if they continued to live in those times, I don't know how they could survive. And maybe that's why my father didn't. And in our case, we came to the United States and nobody wanted to hear what happened. I don't know if people felt guilty they didn't do enough to help, if they didn't want to hear the horrors of what happened. But my family and the other survivors who came here were told to, it was terrible, but you've got to move on and build a new life and not talk about the past. Theirs was a past they had to run away from. For my generation, it's quite different. These memories are memories that I want my grandchildren and their grandchildren to know where they came from. They didn't just suddenly appear in Washington or New York and living beautiful lives. This is the story of their family. As Jews, when we celebrate Passover, we don't celebrate the history of when the Jews left Egypt, whenever that was, and how many people and what year. We're told the story, and we're supposed to feel like we are living that story. And that's what I wanted to do with this book. History is about the end of something. It's something that happened to somebody, it's somebody else's story. Memory's about the beginning of something. It's our story. And it's a very personal story. I think when you look at the Holocaust, you hear that 6 million Jews were killed. Well, that's you can't even get your head around a number like that. But when you hear about these individual people and the individual stories of what they lived through, it becomes much more real. That's the memory. Mine is one among many stories. There's some obviously very famous stories in Holland. And all of these stories are important to give us a sense of what really happened, not just the big number, but what happened to real people.
Mm.
And so for me, I understood that I was the one who had that information. And if it was going to be passed on, I had to be the one to pass it on.
I was curious how your mother felt about your trip to Ukraine. She thought it was a terrible idea in the beginning. And when you came back, she said, you write that she was curious, but also wanted to forget. She was still of two minds after all these years.
Right. I think, I don't know if I mentioned this, the hardest part for me of going, I bought the ticket. I figured out when these Israelis were going and when we'd meet up with them. I found a hotel. My oldest son said he'd go with me. But here I was, a mother and a grandmother, still afraid of my own mother. And the hardest thing was building up the courage to tell her that I was going. And I put it off until the last minute. Everything had been done, but I still hadn't told her. And I called her, and she knew that Jonathan went, and we didn't tell her before he went. We only told her when he came back. And then I think his journey was overshadowed with this movie and all of the hoopla of the book. But now I had to tell her that I was going, and I called her and, somehow summoned the courage to say, Mom, I'm going on this trip to Ukraine. I'm going to meet these people from Trochenbrod who are also going. And she said, this is a woman who at the beginning of the war, when she took off to escape the Holocaust, she didn't know what she was escaping, but she had her instinct told her to run. She never said goodbye to her mother. And here I was telling my mother I was going back to this place. And she yelled into the phone and she said, how can you do this to me? And then I said, well, it's Frank is going with me, my oldest son. She said, oh my God, you're taking your child. He has babies. The next day she did call me back, and she was a smart, intelligent woman. And she said, I want you to understand where all this fear is coming from. And we talked about her fears because we were two strong women, and she didn't want me to go, but she knew I was going. And then before I got on the plane, I had to make one last phone call and say goodbye to her. So I called her, and she was ready with her response. She said, buy granola bars, don't eat anything they give you. She was afraid of our eating pork. She said, bring a good book, stay in your room, there's nothing to see there. And whatever you do, don't do anything stupid. And then, of course, I came back. One of the amazing things about coming back, it was such an emotional journey, leaving there, this place where I found so much. And when we arrived at Dulles International Airport, my husband was there, Frank's wife, Frank's two little girls, and my mother was there. And it was the most joyous reunion.
Then she was proud of you for having done it. There was another photograph of you that I'd like to show together with Frank in Kryninjny, something like that. The new name of the village where your family had lived. When you started, so this was 2009. When I started reading your book, I did the math. It wasn't difficult. And I realized that by the time you finally took the plunge to go, you were 60. So this trip was a long time coming. What took you so long?
What took me so long? I mean, I guess for the same reason that my mother couldn't talk about the past, I wasn't able to deal with it. Maybe I wasn't able to tell her that I was trying to deal with it. And as we said earlier, what I tried to do was to get my sons to do the work for me. But I had finally just reached the point, as I did with the writing of the book, where if this journey was going to go any further, if I was going to find any more, I had to be the one to do it. And also I had the opportunity of, well, by that point, I had all sorts of new information that came from Jonathan's book, from people who called me after he wrote the book and said, well, this is a ridiculous book. This isn't the truth. Here's the real story. So in the interim period between his book and the time that I went, I gathered all sorts of information that helped me find what he wasn't able to find.
And what did the trip mean to Frank?
I'm sorry?
What did the trip mean to your son, to Frank?
So, that's really interesting. I've asked Frank that question. I said, you went with me. Frank is a reporter. He was a magazine editor. He said he went to be a witness to history, and he went as a son to support his mother. And the whole experience of his going, Jonathan's book, and later things that happened with our youngest son, Josh, they each played a role in this trip. As a family, it brought us closer together, and it brought me closer to each of my sons. We were able to share something so deep, so personal, and so important. But I did ask Frank that question. I said, well, did you go as a reporter? And he said, no, I went as a son.
There were some hilarious moments in your reporting on the visit to Ukraine. One of them, for example, was scraping up some dirt for your Ziploc bag with a fork that someone had stolen from the restaurant that morning. The things we do. But you also said something that really intrigued me at one point. You called the trip to Ukraine a suspension of reality. And then you said, sometimes we felt bad for not feeling worse.
Yeah, that was so interesting. And that the whole trip was like that. I mean, here we were going back to this place where all these awful things had happened, and it should have been really sad. But we were going back with all these Israelis who were, fighting with each other, and each knew the right answer. And we took the trip on in a wagon pulled by a horse-drawn wagon, like a hayride. So there were some crazy moments that we shared. that were humorous, that we shared with a community of Israelis who, as we were doing this, we thought, oh my God, if we all still lived in this village, this would be crazy. All these people talking over each other. This must have been what it was like. So yeah, so there were moments, we're going on this hayride essentially, thinking we should be feeling terrible going to see these mass graves. But we've met these people with whom there's a camaraderie and it's a hayride. So yes, that is one of my favorite lines. There were times when we felt bad for not feeling worse. But life is like that.
Exactly. There's always...
And yeah, in writing the book, I was really surprised as I was doing this research and meeting older people who had survived the war from these places, that I learned about divorces in my own family, about abortions in my own family. Whatever happens in life happened in these places that we have kind of idolized in the Fiddler on the Roof image. They lived life as we do.
Just a word to remind our audience that feel free to send in your questions. I can see them rolling in on the iPad, so don't hold back. I wanted to talk about yourself, Esther, not just as a writer of the memoir, but yourself in all these anecdotes and the sadness of the Holocaust and these family stories. We might easily forget that you had a career of your own. You did a master's in political science. You worked for the campaign of George McGovern. You had your own PR firm. And in 2007, you started as the director of Sixth and I, which is a Jewish cultural institution in downtown Washington, D.C. But where did all of that part of Esther stay while the other part of Esther was writing this book?
Well, I guess 2 lives. My mother died at the end of December 2018 at almost 99. And in looking back on her life, I was able to see her strength. She laughed a lot. She was an optimist. And I was blessed to have inherited that part of her DNA. So my life was spent doing amazing things. I married a wonderful man, had a terrific family. I have 6 grandchildren. And I was able to help start a cultural institution in Washington that has, in some ways, changed the face of Washington and of engaging young Jews. And in a way, I think I had to spend my life looking ahead before I was ready to look back. I did not spend any of my professional life or volunteer work involved with the Holocaust. I was involved with the future, telling stories, telling other people's stories, and helping to build a Jewish future. And in a way, I had to do that before I could step back. And I'm so glad that I had both opportunities.
Oh, yeah. We have another photo of your family. That's a big, happy family with lots of children and people smiling. I think it was your yearly Rosh Hashanah card, this photograph. Yeah. And it made me think of something I'd read in the book in the epilogue where you describe your mother's funeral. She was quite a tough cookie, huh? And at this funeral, there are lots and lots of family, children, grandchildren, aunts and uncles. They're all piling out of the car. And one of the grandchildren sees the whole mishpocha and says, "Take that, Hitler." And that got me wondering about the title of your book. I want you to know we're still here. Who is the you that you're addressing? Are those your ancestors? Are those future generations? Is that Hitler? Who's the you?
It's not Hitler. I don't want to give him that much credit. And I was sort of surprised when this child jumped out of a limo with, so many people piling out at my mother's funeral, and that Hitler had to even be there at the funeral. But the you is my ancestors and my descendants. And I'm very proud of these Rosh Hashanah cards. I do them every year. It's really important for me to get our family together. And these are just my descendants. I have a brother, I have stepsisters. There are lots more descendants. But it's really important for me to have them all together and to look at what came in the future. So when I was in Ukraine, and I went to these mass graves with the fork borrowed from the restaurant, digging up little bags of dirt, I also felt like I wanted to leave something behind. Now, why? It's hard to explain. Whatever I was going to leave behind was in the Ukrainian winter, in these fields that nobody goes to. But I decided that I wanted to bring these pictures of my family, of my children and my grandchildren, and put them in the graves of my grandmothers and my grandfathers and my aunts and my cousins, and to say, they went to their deaths probably thinking no one survived, but we're still here. And it's a message of optimism that with everything that happened, we are here. We built a family. All three of my sons are storytellers. They're doing things that I believe and I hope makes the world a better place. And they're followed by 6 grandchildren who will also take their place in this line. And that was my important message, that we're still here. And it's the message of the book, that it's not just the horror of what happened, but it's a story of redemption. It's a story of the future.
I was amazed to read how much you were able to find in these empty, remote fields in Ukraine. The name of your father's first daughter, your half-sister, the family who helped your father go into hiding after his whole village had been murdered, the house where your mother had lived. Your research really paid off. It was amazing. And what I wondered is also something that Marianne sent in as a question here on the iPad, wondering whether, with everything that you've found out now, you've written the book, you've told the story, are you at peace now that you've been able to reconstruct your family history?
That's a great question. Have I found the whole truth? Probably not, but I am at peace. I'm at peace because I did the work, the research, because I had the opportunity to write it, and because that story will exist for future generations that will still be here.
I was wondering about something you mentioned in another interview about this book. You said that for the first time since the Sixth and I, the cultural institutions in an old synagogue where you worked, has existed, that there was anti-Semitic graffiti on it.
Right.
We are seeing here in Europe a real rise in anti-Semitism. Are you witnessing that as well?
Yes, very much so. Our Sixth and I is kind of the premier Jewish venue now in Washington. And one night, the swastikas were carved into the wooden doors. We're seeing anti-Semitism. We're seeing all sorts of right-wing activity, not just against Jews, but against lots of other groups of people. I find myself sympathizing, feeling close to the immigrants who are trying to cross borders, who are leaving their horrific lives. I was a child with nowhere to go. And you'll see in the book, we came into the United States under the 1948 DP Immigration Act, which was very anti-Semitic. And the reason my father had to change my birth certificates so that we could qualify under that act. To about 200,000 people were going to be admitted because of the way it was worded. It was worded intentionally to keep out Jews. Only 80,000 Jews were admitted. And it's been said that about 10,000 Nazis made it into the United States under this Displaced Persons Refugee Act. So as a Jew, as a refugee, as a child of survivors, I look not only at anti-Semitism, but so much that's going on in the world, and history is repeating itself.
Mm, mm. I want to come back to your mother just briefly. I really came to like her a lot. This crusty old lady, what a tough bird. Well, it turned out that she was really good with finance. She helped a lot of people with interest-free loans. She was very good with money, as was your father. But when after surviving the war, coming to the U.S., they had started businesses that stopped, of course, when he passed away. But your mother apparently was really able to adapt to these new circumstances. But there was one thing that never left her. She was always afraid that there wouldn't be enough to eat. And that you write, it's so funny, the kitchen cupboards are stuffed with enough for 3 more world wars. She was an obsessive coupon cutter and would go to the store and was always trying to get someone to take her to the store to redeem her coupons, right? And there was something that I thought was so such a delightful personal detail that as she was getting older, sometimes in her walker, you would find little pieces of chocolate that she'd stashed away for just in case.
Right.
But that's also a sign of fear. So she was a survivor. She embraced this new life, but she still had that very deep fear inside her.
She was a survivor. And was it a fear or was it a survival mechanism? I have found that I write about the cupboards that she had that had enough sugar and flour to withstand any catastrophe. A couple of weeks ago, like lots of people in this pandemic, I decided to bake bread. And I sent out for Instacart. I don't go to the grocery store right now because of coronavirus. And the Instacart person sent me back a picture of the shelves. There was no flour. Everybody had taken the flour. If I had only listened to my mother, I would have had that stockpile. And I'm sure she is laughing at me going like, how could you end up like this as my daughter? Yesterday, I had the family over. It's appropriate social distancing. I have a new little great niece who's named for my mother, and we were all doing a little barbecue, and I baked my mother's sugar cookies. She was famous for her sugar cookies. And my son says, they don't taste like Bubby's cookies. He said, you used real butter. She margarine. And I'm constantly reminded of the way she cut corners and the way I found myself always adding a little extra, trying to do, the pure ingredient that she would kind of try to save money on. And it just doesn't taste like hers.
Oh, hilarious. But you also mention a number of times in the book that the past is not just a burden on your family because of the Holocaust over there or here in Europe. It's also a burden because you feel the obligation to bring joy to the family. You have to not be a burden to your mother. And I think this is something that a lot of second-generation survivors are familiar with. They're feeling that there's this tremendous responsibility weighing on them to make everything all right again. Did you have that feeling with your mother, or am I just off in left field?
No, you're right on the mark. I'm the oldest child, almost from the beginning. And maybe it was growing up in that, spending the first few years in the DP camp. There was just an instinctive understanding that my job was to bring joy. That there was, I don't know how old I was that I was aware of that they had been through terrible things. And somehow I had to make up for that. I could not be the kid who was making trouble in class. I had to be the kid getting A. I had to, have the perfect household and lay everything out perfectly. And actually, it's kind of liberating to not feel that I have to do that all the time now. But yeah, that very much came with the territory. I had to be the good little girl bringing joy.
Yeah. Well, it's a sign already that you feel free to say that.
I had a wonderful conversation. I think the writing of the book has liberated me so much. has allowed me to understand my vulnerabilities. It's just been such an important process, both in the stories and the memories that I'm going to be able to pass on now, that long after no one is buying this book, it will sit on the bookshelves of my descendants and they will have these stories. But it also gave me the freedom to let go of a lot of this and to let go of the need for perfection, and also to let go of some of the silence I've had to live with.
Oh, yeah. I have one more question, and then I have a little bit of homework for you, Esther.
Okay.
The final question is, in the beginning of this year, I believe it was in February, the Trump administration announced the creation of a denaturalization section within the Justice Department. That means that the Justice Department can strip people of their naturalized citizens of their U.S. nationality. And they have also started doing that already at a pace that we haven't seen since the days of McCarthy. You came to the U.S. as a child on forged documents. Are you worried?
Even saying that in the book, my husband is a lawyer, by the way.
Oh, maybe just as well.
And he urged me not to say that. And I ended up starting the book with that story. I felt, how could I not? How could I not stand with some of the young immigrants right now who are dreamers in the United States? Do I think I'll be deported? Probably not. But I felt I needed to take that stand. But interestingly, before I did it, I consulted with a very prominent immigration lawyer who was head of all of the U.S. Immigration Lawyers Association. And I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do, but I want to understand my risks. And he said, you're not without risk. Probably nothing will happen, but you need to know that there is a risk. And the end of our conversation, he said, your husband could petition for you, your sons could petition for you if they decide to deport you. But at the end of our conversation, he said, why don't you go get a Polish passport? You were born in Poland. You'd have an option. And I was recently in Warsaw, and I'm actually pursuing that. Because even in Warsaw, and whoever thought that I'd want to go back and get a Polish passport, but it's also part of we're still here. I was born in Poland, and we're still here. Do I think something will happen to me? I don't know. I doubt it. But it was important for me to say that, to take my stand along with the people who are suffering so much right now.
And here's your homework to finish off our wonderful interview. There's a lovely scene in the beginning of the book where your granddaughter Sadie is sitting in your study, and it's filled with folders and piles and boxes of photographs and all these people. She has no idea who they are. And you wonder out loud, how will she ever know if I don't get all this organized? But then you go on to whatever comes next. Have you gotten it organized so that Sadie will know who these people are and that they were still here?
Yes. And I've started that process, and I am so delighted that because I've worked on these family memories, she is now the self-described family historian of her generation. So I passed that instinct on to her, that love of family, that need to understand where we came from.
And she now knows who all these people are?
Some of them. Well, she has read the book. I still have work to do. I wrote that down. I still have homework.
Well, Esther, it leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us. Even if you're not here in person, I still feel that you're very close, and I think this conversation was every bit as intimate as we could have had on stage physically.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us. I wish you all the success in the world with your book and, of course, the Dutch translation. For our audience, if you can read it in Dutch, do buy it in Dutch, because we want publishers to continue to translate important books like this, and well, give the regards of the John Adams to Jonathan, and hope he'll come back soon.
Thank you very much. I look forward to actually being in Amsterdam next time.
Good. See you soon.
Thank you.